So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. The popular image of Roman gladiators is shaped by cinema. Armored men saluting the emperor, crowds roaring, the clash of steel under a bright Mediterranean sky. Yet the true machinery of the arena extended far beyond the sand. Beneath the spectacle stood a system of captivity that absorbed entire populations during Rome's expansion. Among the most vulnerable within that system were captive women. Their fate, often unrecorded in detail, was shaped by economics, law, and the institutional routines of the gladiatorial schools. What happened to them rarely appeared in official inscriptions, yet surviving legal codes, graffiti, and scattered historical references reveal a controlled environment where survival meant submission to structures more enduring than the games themselves. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had become the dominant power of the Mediterranean. Military campaigns in Gaul, Hispania, North Africa, Greece, and the Near East produced a steady flow of prisoners. Captives were processed as property under Roman law. Men suitable for combat were sorted for labor, mines, agriculture, or military slavery. Some were sold to lanistae, the managers of gladiatorial schools, known as ludi. Women and children followed separate paths within this same commercial network. They were cataloged, transported, and assigned value based on age, health, and perceived utility. The ludus was not merely a training ground for fighters. It functioned as a fortified compound, part prison and part business enterprise. Gladiators lived in cells arranged around internal courtyards. They trained under strict regimens supervised by doctores, specialized instructors. Discipline was enforced by guards. Diets were calculated to increase body mass and stamina. Contracts bound free volunteers for fixed terms, but most gladiators were enslaved. Within this enclosed world, women served multiple roles that reflected the economic logic of the institution. Some women were assigned domestic labor within the gladiatorial schools. They cooked, cleaned equipment, maintained living quarters, and washed blood-stained gear after exhibitions. The sand of the arena was replaced after each event, but armor and weapons required careful maintenance. The scale of operations in large cities such as Rome, Capua, and Pompeii demanded continuous labor. Women performed these tasks under supervision, rarely recorded by name. Other women were attached to gladiators themselves. In Roman society, enslaved individuals could be allocated as personal attendants. A successful fighter represented a financial investment. Lanistae sought to protect that investment by controlling every aspect of a gladiator's life, including companionship. Some captive women were designated as partners to specific fighters. This arrangement was not recognized as legal marriage under Roman law if both parties were enslaved. It was an internal management decision designed to stabilize behavior within the ludus. Attachment reduced escape attempts and reinforced loyalty to the ludus. The consequences extended beyond companionship. Children born within these compounds inherited the status of their mothers. If the mother was enslaved, the child was automatically property of the owner. This principle, embedded in Roman legal doctrine, ensured a self-sustaining population of dependents. Boys with physical potential could be raised and trained for combat. Girls were integrated into domestic service or sold. The arena thus generated its own supply chain, rooted in the status of captive women. Inscriptions from Pompeii provide indirect confirmation. Graffiti etched into walls by admirers praised specific gladiators, naming them as objects of fascination. Some inscriptions mention women associated with fighters. The tone suggests visibility rather than secrecy. Gladiators, though enslaved, occupied a paradoxical space in Roman culture. They were marginalized socially, yet celebrated publicly. Women connected to them shared in this ambiguous status, simultaneously controlled and displayed. Not all captive women remained within the schools. Amphitheaters hosted events beyond standard duels. Historical records indicate that executions were staged as midday spectacles. Condemned prisoners, including women,
sometimes were incorporated into dramatized performances. Mythological reenactments placed individuals in roles drawn from legend. In these presentations, the line between theater and punishment dissolved. The participants had no agency in the script. They were positioned as symbols of Rome's authority and as warnings to the crowd. Archaeological evidence from North Africa and Italy includes relief carvings depicting female figures in arena contexts. While interpretation varies, some scholars argue that these images represent female participants in staged displays. Female gladiatrixes, known as gladiatrices, are documented in limited sources. An inscription from Ostia refers to women fighting in the arena during the reign of Nero. Another relief discovered in Halicarnassus portrays two female combatants named Amazon and Achillea. However, such instances were rare and often presented as novelties. The majority of captive women connected to the arena did not fight for sport. They sustained the system that enabled others to fight. Life expectancy within the gladiatorial environment was shaped by violence and disease. Medical care existed, as evidenced by surgical tools recovered from gladiator barracks in Pompeii. Physicians employed by the schools treated wounds and fractures. Survival of trained fighters was financially advantageous. For women performing labor, medical support was less documented, but likely present to preserve workforce value. Even so, mortality rates in enslaved populations in antiquity were high. Malnutrition, infection, and childbirth complications posed continuous risks. The social identity of captive women was defined by legal invisibility. Roman law categorized them as res, property. They could not initiate contracts or possess independent legal standing. Testimony under torture was admissible in court because enslaved individuals were considered inherently unreliable unless coerced. In the arena economy, this framework enabled total administrative control. Punishments for resistance ranged from confinement to public execution. Escape was difficult. Branding and physical markers identified ownership. Despite these constraints, traces of individuality emerge in scattered records. Funerary inscriptions occasionally commemorate enslaved women by name, erected by fellow slaves or sympathetic patrons. One epitaph from Rome honors a woman described as a faithful companion within a gladiatorial household. The wording suggests attachment formed under constraint, reflecting human adaptation to institutional conditions. The broader Roman public understood the arena as entertainment and civic ritual. Amphitheaters symbolized imperial generosity. Emperors sponsored games to display power and secure popularity. The cost of hosting spectacles was immense, covering animals imported from Africa, elaborate stage machinery, and payments to Lanistae. Behind this display operated a logistical network reliant on enslaved labor, including captive women, whose contributions remained unacknowledged. Economic records from later imperial periods indicate fluctuating demand for gladiatorial shows. By the 3rd century CE, financial pressures and shifting cultural attitudes began to affect the scale of events. Christianity's gradual expansion introduced moral critiques of blood sports. Imperial edicts in the 4th and 5th centuries restricted certain practices. In 404 CE, Emperor Honorius is traditionally credited with issuing a ban on gladiatorial combat following the death of a monk who intervened in a fight. Though enforcement varied, the institution declined.
For captive women embedded within gladiatorial systems, such reforms altered but did not immediately erase conditions of servitude. Slavery remained integral to Roman society until the empire's transformation in late antiquity. The end of formal gladiatorial combat did not dismantle the legal structure governing enslaved lives. Modern understanding of these women relies on fragmentary evidence. Ancient historians such as Tacitus and Suetonius focused on emperors and political intrigue. They rarely detailed the daily operations of gladiator households. Archaeology fills some gaps. Barracks layouts, chains, inscriptions, and skeletal remains contribute data. Osteological studies of remains found near amphitheaters show signs of repetitive strain and healed trauma,
indicating prolonged labor. The phrase "worse than death" reflects not spectacle, but continuity. Death in the arena was visible and immediate. The existence of captive women within the gladiatorial world was prolonged, regulated, and economically exploited across years. Their labors sustained the fighters who drew applause. Their children replenished the ranks. Their identities were absorbed into property inventories. Roman expansion created the conditions. Military conquest produced captives in vast numbers. Market mechanisms distributed them. Legal doctrines fixed their status. Cultural appetite for spectacle transformed human lives into components of public display. Within that structure, captive women experienced a reality defined by routine, discipline, and lack of autonomy. The story of the arena is often told from the perspective of combat, yet the institution's endurance depended on infrastructure hidden from the audience. The barracks, kitchens, infirmaries, and holding cells formed an ecosystem. Captive women stood at its center, maintaining daily operations that allowed the spectacle to proceed uninterrupted. When amphitheaters stand today in cities such as Rome, Verona, and Nîmes, they appear as architectural achievements. Stone arches and tiered seating remain. The sand is gone. The crowds are silent. Beneath those stones once operated a controlled environment shaped by law and commerce. Within that structure, captive women lived lives recorded only in fragments.
As Rome shifted from republic to empire, the arena evolved from a funeral rite performed by aristocratic families into a state-managed industry. This transformation intensified the systems that controlled captive populations. For women drawn into the orbit of gladiatorial schools, the change meant deeper integration into a commercial network that stretched across continents. During the late Republic, ambitious politicians sponsored games to secure public favor. Julius Caesar expanded the scale of spectacles dramatically, importing exotic animals and organizing large combat exhibitions. After the establishment of imperial rule under Augustus, gladiatorial shows became tied to imperial identity. Emperors assumed responsibility for regulating ludi and licensing lanistae. Official oversight did not reduce exploitation, it standardized it. The supply of captives followed Rome's military frontiers. Campaigns in Germania, Britain, Dacia, and the eastern provinces produced new waves of prisoners. Women captured in these conflicts were processed through slave markets in regional hubs such as Ephesus, Delos, Antioch, and Carthage. Merchants assessed physical condition, age, and specialized skills. Some captives were trained artisans or literate individuals. Others were agricultural laborers. Those judged physically resilient could be routed toward gladiatorial enterprises. Transportation was organized through maritime and overland routes. Captives were moved in groups under guard. Branding sometimes marked ownership. Shackles recovered from archaeological sites demonstrate standardized restraint devices. Upon arrival in Italy or major provincial cities, captives were auctioned. Lanistae inspected potential purchases carefully. Investment decisions were calculated. Maintenance of a gladiatorial school required predictable returns. Within the empire, regional amphitheaters varied in size and resources. The Colosseum in Rome represented the peak of scale, capable of seating tens of thousands. Provincial cities such as Lyon, Tarragona, and El Gem also maintained large arenas. Each site required an administrative staff, trainers, guards, animal handlers, physicians, and domestic workers. Captive women were absorbed into these layered hierarchies. The imperial period introduced stricter registration systems. Contracts for free volunteers, known as auctoritate, were recorded formally. Enslaved individuals were cataloged as property assets. Account tablets discovered at sites like Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall revealed detailed supply records, illustrating the Roman tendency toward bureaucratic precision.
Though no complete ledger from a gladiatorial school survives, parallels from agricultural estates indicate similar documentation. Women assigned to a litis would have been listed alongside tools and livestock, with estimated values reflecting market conditions. Economic pressures shaped daily life. A gladiator represented high potential revenue. Victorious fighters attracted sponsorship and public loyalty. To protect this investment, Lenni enforced discipline through schedules and surveillance. Women attached to the school were expected to maintain order. Food preparation required strict measurement. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains suggests that gladiators consumed a diet rich in barley and legumes to promote body mass. Preparing such rations demanded labor. Grinding grain, baking bread, and brewing beverages were repetitive tasks performed under supervision. Regional variation influenced conditions. In frontier provinces, amphitheaters doubled as symbols of Roman authority. In newly conquered territories, staging games reinforced imperial dominance. Captive women from local populations sometimes remained near their homeland, but under Roman control, serving institutions that displayed the power that had subjugated them. In contrast, women transported to Rome experienced geographic dislocation that severed community ties. Isolation reduced the likelihood of coordinated resistance. Roman law permitted manumission under specific circumstances. An enslaved person could be freed by an owner's declaration, by testament, or by purchase of freedom. In practice, opportunities were limited. A gladiator who survived multiple victories might earn release. For women within the same system, prospects were narrower. Domestic workers in elite households occasionally secured freedom through long service. In gladiatorial schools, survival did not guarantee advancement. The owner's financial interest in retaining skilled labor discouraged emancipation. The empire also codified punishments. The Lex Patronia, enacted in the 1st century CE, restricted a master's ability to send slaves to fight beasts without judicial approval. While this law offered minimal protection, it demonstrated recognition of extreme abuse. Enforcement depended on local authorities. Captive women within gladiatorial networks remained vulnerable to discretionary discipline that seldom reached formal courts. Entertainment culture evolved during the imperial era. Morning Venetians featured animal hunts. Midday executions displayed condemned criminals. Afternoon combats presented trained gladiators. The scheduling separated categories of participants. Women sentenced as criminals could be included in public punishments, often framed as mythological reenactments. These performances reinforced moral narratives defined by Roman authority. The individuals involved had no recorded voice in the event. Literary references from Juvenal and Martial mention women attending games and expressing admiration for fighters. These texts illustrate the social magnetism surrounding gladiators. They do not detail the lives of enslaved women behind the scenes. The contrast between public fascination and private invisibility underscores the structure of the institution. In some cases, wealthy patrons acquired gladiators for private exhibitions. Villas in rural Italy hosted smaller-scale combats. Transporting fighters required logistical support teams, including cooks and attendants. Captive women traveled with these retinues, extending their labor beyond permanent schools. Mobility increased exposure to varied regional customs, but did not alter legal status. Religious life within gladiatorial compounds reflected diversity. Captives brought local beliefs from Gaul, Thrace, Syria, and North Africa. Small shrines discovered in barracks suggest that enslaved individuals maintained devotional practices. Women likely participated in household rituals, preserving fragments of cultural identity. However, participation occurred within the boundaries permitted by owners. The transition from republic to empire also professionalized medical oversight. Physicians specializing in trauma care were attached to major ludi. Surgical instruments recovered from Pompeii indicate procedures for bone setting and wound treatment. Medical care was a financial safeguard.
Women injured during labor tasks may have received basic treatments to maintain productivity. Severe injury could result in resale or abandonment, depending on the owner's calculation of cost versus benefit. Demographic patterns reveal another dimension. High mortality among enslaved populations required continuous replenishment. Wars supplied captives in the early imperial period. As territorial expansion slowed in the 2nd century CE, slave supply tightened. This shift increased the economic value of enslaved individuals. For women within gladiatorial systems, heightened value did not translate to autonomy. It intensified monitoring and reproductive exploitation to sustain internal labor pools. By the 3rd century CE, political instability and economic strain affected public entertainment budgets. Emperors faced military crises and inflation. Some amphitheaters fell into partial disuse. Records indicate fewer large-scale games in certain regions. Yet the institutions did not vanish immediately. Captive women continued to perform domestic and logistical roles, even as spectacle frequency fluctuated.
The rise of Christianity introduced ideological opposition to arena violence. Early Christian writers condemned blood sports as morally corrosive. Imperial policies gradually reflected this influence. Constantine issued edicts discouraging certain executions in arenas. Later emperors restricted gladiatorial schools. Nevertheless, slavery persisted, and women formerly attached to gladiatorial enterprises were absorbed into other labor sectors when schools closed. Archaeological layers from abandoned amphitheaters show evidence of repurposing. Some sites became housing complexes or marketplaces. Stones were quarried for new construction. The institutional framework dissolved over time, but the lives shaped by it left limited documentation. Without personal diaries or extensive testimony, reconstruction depends on legal texts, inscriptions, and comparative economic models. The phrase "worse than death" in historical analysis refers to sustained erasure of legal identity. Death in the arena was recorded as an event. Prolonged servitude was recorded as property maintenance. Captive women existed within a ledger system that reduced human experience to asset management. Their labor stabilized an entertainment industry central to Roman civic identity. In examining the imperial transformation, patterns become clear. Conquest produced captives. Commerce distributed them. Law codified their status. Administration regulated their use. Public spectacle depended on their unseen work. The arena functioned as a visible apex of a concealed pyramid sustained by captive labor. As the empire moved toward late antiquity, structural changes altered outward forms but preserved hierarchical principles. Amphitheaters faded from prominence, yet estates, workshops, and households continued to rely on enslaved women. The gladiatorial chapter closed gradually, leaving architectural monuments and sparse inscriptions as evidence. The historical record remains incomplete. However, enough fragments survive to outline a system in which captive women formed an essential yet unrecognized foundation of Rome's most famous institution. Their presence linked distant battlefields to the sand of the arena. Their lives unfolded within walls built for spectacle, but maintained through routine discipline.